Join us by the fireside for our evening tales of true life's strange experiences with things that lie beyond the veil of the known and into the misty depths of the mysterious and unknown. The camping trip. I was on a camping trip in 2017 when this incident happened. I was at a campsite in Oregon. I'm not going to mention which one right now, but anyway, it was about 2 hours drive from home. This time I had decided to go alone, but normally my wife and our 12-year-old son would also come along. I'd been working long hours. I'm a surgeon, and I needed a break. Plus, I just found out my wife had, been cheating on me with a coworker. So I needed time alone to think, and I had always loved this place. And I had many happy memories from camping trips there, going way back to when I was a kid. On this particular day, I arrived at about 10 a.m., and I drove to the site and started setting up the tent. It was a Monday, and I planned to stay a whole week, just to really kind of relax. It was late spring, it was sunny, and it was a warm morning, and I was surprised not to see more people there, to be honest. My area was a bit more remote and set back from all the other sites. It was also surrounded by trees, and you couldn't see any other tents or cars from that spot. So it was really kind of nice and private and secluded. On the way there, I had only seen 3 other cars and 2 tents, but they were spread apart. It was really just the way I hoped it would be. It was nice and peaceful and no crowds. I felt very comfortable as I settled down in my tent, which was one of those that you can stand up in, and it had 2 kind of zip-up partitions inside, which created 2 separate rooms. So it was really nice and spacious, and I had a fold-up chair and table set up, a soft, cozy air mattress and blanket, and even a small portable heater. There was even a little kitchen area with a window by the door to the tent, and I had my gas stove and cookware all ready on another table. I made something to eat for lunch, and then just decided to go for a hike and arrived back before sunset. I had my hiking backpack ready with basic supplies and a few emergency things in case of problems. I didn't have a gun, but I always took pepper spray, the kind that's good for deterring bears. I knew the whole area like the back of my hand, so I wasn't nervous about hiking alone in a wilderness. So I took the south trail that eventually led down to a creek. It meandered along narrow dirt trails through the forest. I had my camera with me in case I saw any interesting wildlife or, interesting vegetation, flowers, and so on. I must have hiked for about 2 hours, took pictures, sat and rested on a rock formation, and then just walked along the creek for a while. And then I decided it was probably a good idea to start heading back, since I never did like hiking in remote places past a certain time, even on long summer days. So I turned around and started back along the same trails. After a little over 2 hours, I was back at the campsite area I knew so well, except that something was different. I was in the area that the trail ended and began at, the point where I had started basically. 2 minutes away from my own tent area next to the shower building, except that the building was no longer there. It was an open area, and on my way in, I had seen the other campers, but now there was no sign of anybody. I was sure I had arrived at the right place because, as I said, I had been coming to this exact spot since I was a kid, and I know it like the back of my hand. Where was the shower building and the cars and tents of the other campers? What the hell was going on? Could it be the building was somehow removed while I was gone and all the other people just happened to leave? But how could the building just be removed within the 4 hours I was gone? It was a sort of log cabin type of building, but it didn't seem mobile from what I recalled. Maybe it was, but I just never noticed. Yet what was the other option? That it just vanished into thin air? I was actually pretty shaken by now, because I had no answers for this. But I told myself that maybe for whatever reason, I had some kind of lapse in memory and perhaps I had in fact arrived at the wrong side of the camp. And that maybe it was identical to the rest of the trailheads or something. So I just retraced my steps and took another trail that would lead into another side of the camp just to test things. It took me round a loop trail, but then came back into the camping area on the other side. No, this place I recognized well too, and it was definitely not the place closest to my tent. So I headed back to the original trail and arrived once again where the showers should have been, but they weren't there. Part of me had hoped I would arrive this second time to find the building in place, but it was still missing. Nobody was around. Now I was getting scared. But very apprehensively, I headed to where my tent was, behind the trees. My heart quickened with the anxiety as I neared the corner, where my tent and car were behind the trees and bushes. Reluctantly, I stopped and just kind of peered round a large bush to look at the tent site. Honestly, I felt like I dropped dead on the spot in that moment. As I looked, wide-eyed now, at the exact spot where my tent and SUV should have been. Everything was gone. No tent, no car, no signs of my having arrived even, no camping supplies outside. Absolutely nothing. Terrified now, I threw down my backpack and fumbled around in the pockets for my cell phone. Relieved, I pulled it out, excitedly trying to turn it on, but it turned on for about 5 seconds, made a loud electronic sound like a sort of alarm or something, and then turned off again, now completely dead. It had never done this before. In total shock and dismay, I fell to my knees and wept. Soon it would be dark. What was I going to do now? After about 10 minutes of just sitting there in a state of shock and my mind reeling with thoughts and looking for rational explanations such as, maybe this was an elaborate hoax, or maybe robbers had stolen everyone's stuff, driven everyone away with guns, etc. But what about the missing shower building? And I hadn't even checked if the portable toilet closest to me was still there. With that thought, I decided to check, even if just to comfort myself that I was still sane. With that horrible feeling of apprehension and anxiety, I forced my shaky legs to walk over to where the toilet should be. The moment I walked over there and saw that it still stood in its original location, a wave of relief and hope seemed to fill me. I rushed over to it as though it held the secret to my sanity or something, and connection to the known world or something, I don't know. It sounds weird, I know, but that's how I felt in those crazy moments. I opened the door, stepped in, and locked it, and then put the toilet top down and just sat there with my head in my hands, not knowing what the hell had happened. I felt strangely safe in there. And there was something about the stillness of the forest all of a sudden that felt very unnatural, spooky kind of. It was also getting dark now, as it seems I'd lost track of time and had been wandering about and sitting and pondering my situation for a long time, longer than I had expected. There was no electricity to charge my phone, no landline on site, no other buildings, nobody around me as far as I knew. I had no way to get help, so I figured I'd sleep there in the porta toilet for the night, away from wild animals and whatever unknown things might be out there, because at this point, I was willing to accept anything was possible, and the last thing I wanted was to sleep in the open all night. In the morning, I resolved that I would set out early and try to hike along the paved road until a car came by that could offer me a ride, or whose phone I could use to call for help. So with this plan in mind, I actually started to feel much better. And as I told myself there had to be a logical explanation for all this, I unpacked a few emergency food items from my pack and my water, a light sleeping pad and a blanket, and I just laid them on the floor, which fortunately was clean enough, although it was a small space. So I couldn't fully stretch out, but it had a sink in there too, and it was actually larger than the usual Porta-Potty toilets because it was one of the handicap access ones, which are always a little bit bigger. I had a wristwatch so I could see the time, and after laying there for what seemed like 2 hours, listening to the crickets and night birds, small animals and so on moving about outside, I eventually fell asleep. I slept very deeply, and I woke up with a start. I had for some reason broken into a cold sweat when I woke up, and the air was unusually cold. I noticed there were no sounds of animals or birds, no insects. It was suddenly dead silent outside. I looked at my watch in the darkness. It was 12:15 a.m. I didn't know why, but I woke up feeling really scared, like something dangerous was lurking close by. I wondered whether my survival instincts had detected a bear close by, so I decided to stay very still and make sure that any food was packed away in my bag so it wouldn't smell anything edible in there and break down the toilet or the door. I noticed a strange, perceptible, static kind of feeling is the only way I can explain it. It was like a sort of high-pitched electrical sound that also came to my left ear, like being close to high-voltage wires or, transformer or whatever. It was odd, and I didn't know what to make of it. My fear intensified suddenly, too. And for a second, I heard something that sounded like a voice, or voices. I listened intently, trying to hear if it was real. Then I heard them. They were not quite human, because they were deep, harsh, kind of growling sounds they made. They spoke, but I couldn't understand the language. It wasn't a known language. Then one of them screeched loudly so that the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I cowered in my flimsy plastic sanctuary. They sounded like they were only about 20 feet away. And from the voices, it sounded like there were two of them. Probably both male from their deep voices, I figured. They were very large. They weren't animals, but they were humanoid, primitive, savage. I felt the kind of fear that comes from being around something truly dangerous and evil. In my terror, I wondered if they were Bigfoot, but there was something about the way I felt in this presence and that static air that told me this was something supernatural, not a physical monster like Bigfoot. I crouched there, shivering with cold and fear, listening, praying to any higher power that could hear me for help. Then one of them screeched again, a demonic sound that hurt my senses. Then it laughed, deep, guttural, and full of evil intent. I wondered, in a sort of suicidal way, what these things looked like, and a crazy thought came over me. What if I stood on the toilet and looked out, through the ventilation holes at the top. There was enough moonlight that I'd be able to see them. I stepped onto the toilet as silently as I could, looked at the ventilation gaps, but something inside me screamed, "No, don't do it!" And I quietly got back down and crouched on the floor again and resumed my request for help from the powers beyond, longing for this nightmare to end, for morning. They kept talking, cackling like hideous old hags or something, laughing those horrible laughs that made me cover my ears to protect myself from the effect it had. Tears rolled down my face at that point. I thought of my son and how much I loved him, my mom, my dad. Would I ever see them again? Then something thumped against the side of the toilet, horrified that they had found out I was in there and that they were playing with me. I covered my mouth with my hand, trying to control my heavy breathing and my sobs. Whatever they had thrown at the toilet had actually hit the side, and looking down, wild-eyed with fear, I noticed a kind of ventilation hole near the floor on that side. Trembling, I put my head close to the floor and peered through the hole. In the moonlight, about 2 feet from the sides of the Porta-Potty, lay something long, flesh-colored, bloody, stumped. As soon as I realized what it was, I involuntarily jerked back. Stunned, shaking uncontrollably now, I grabbed some toilet paper and stuffed it into the hole to cover it. What I had seen was unmistakably a human male leg, a whole leg without the foot. Now, as a surgeon, gore doesn't faze me, but this situation and its implications was a whole other thing. And I was numb with terror. And to be honest, I really didn't think I'd survive. I honestly thought I was their next victim. And with this expectation came a strange sense of surrendering to my fate. And then my grandma's face came to my mind as I sat with my eyes closed, trying to block out the horror outside by blocking my ears with my hands. I remembered something she said years back when I was a kid. She used to follow a religion, not a mainstream one, but they believed in God, reincarnation, karma, and so on. Anyways, she had a wisdom and knowledge about things that was really something special. She said that day that if I was ever faced with life-threatening danger that I couldn't see a way out of, to close my eyes if possible and put my full attention on someone or more than one person I loved and feel that love and the happy moments with them. She said that love would protect me. She said some people think of angels, God, religious figures, etc., but that the whole point was to focus on love and a higher power of goodness. So remembering her words, I put my full attention on my son. I remembered holding him as a baby, seeing his smile, feeling his embrace, his love. I became so engrossed in this, on his face, his voice, that it took 15 to 20 minutes before I came out of it, unblocked my ears, and listened. There was nothing but the sound of crickets and birds. The awful, static silence had gone. The cold sweat and terror of just a few minutes ago and the sense of fatal danger and dread was suddenly lifted, like a cloud had been lifted. I knew with a sort of inner certainty that I was going to be all right. But I didn't have the courage to remove the toilet paper from the vent hole and look out to see if the gruesome limb was still there. I wrapped my blanket around me, curled up in a fetal position, and fell into a kind of deep, unconscious sleep. I was abruptly awoken by a knock on the door, and quickly getting up, I saw it was morning, early still. I was too scared to open the door at first, and I kept silent. Then a man's voice called out, "Is anyone in there? This is Officer Roberts. Are you in there?" My relief was immense, and I rushed to the door and threw open the door so fast that the ranger reached for his weapon. I held up my hands and said it was fine, I was unarmed, and I pointed to the side of the porta toilet and asked him if there was anything there. He was puzzled and suspicious at first, but then he carefully peered around the side, still keeping an eye on me, and said, "No, there's nothing there." I then explained everything that had happened, expecting him to look at me like I was crazy, but instead, he looked very serious and listened to every detail, taking notes, etc. Later, he drove me to my tent spot, and to my amazement, there was my SUV, the tent, and everything in it. He stayed with me while I packed everything away, and then I followed him to the ranger station a half hour away. I noticed as we drove out that the shower building was there, in its usual place again, but there were no signs of campers or cars or people anywhere. He told me that since there was nobody else around and he didn't find me in the tent, that he had decided to, go check and, just kind of routinely to make sure that everything was okay. And that's when he, found the toilets locked, and he just, and that's how he found me. So anyway, we arrived at the station, and I again repeated the experience of the previous evening. Nobody laughed at me or made stupid jokes, which was, I was actually quite surprised. They were all dead serious after the interrogation. As I was leaving, I was chatting with one older ranger, and I asked him what he thought happened. He said that other people in the past had also reported weird incidents in that campsite, and that a few days before I arrived there, one hiker that was camping not far from where I pitched my tent had gone missing, and they had been looking for him, and they were still searching, and they hadn't found any sign of him. He said that through the years, other people had also gone missing in the area, and no traces of them were ever found. I asked, what about the disappearing showers and the other campers and the cars and so on, just kind of vanishing? He said he had no explanation for that, and that it's just part of the weirdness of the place, like it sort of shifts into another dimension or something from time to time. He also said that he didn't know what the voices were that I heard, but he has also had reports of, people seeing strange creatures or Native American stories about skinwalkers and so on. Anyway, I was pretty freaked out after talking to him, but truly grateful to be alive. I drove home to my son. It felt like I had a new lease on life, like I had escaped some kind of horrible death. I'm not ready to tell him what happened, and at some point, I'll have to explain to him why I can never camp anywhere again, or hike in forests ever. The terror of that night has left too deep a scar on me, but I do feel I was protected. Perhaps Grandma was watching over me after all. I'd like to think so, and in fact, deep down, I believe so. The Banshee. This happened about 5 years ago, probably a few days after my grandfather died. We were at my grandmother's house. It was more of a Frankenstein collection of a small farmhouse with various bits added on for guests. She ran a B&B, and a couple of tenants, and her house was out in the countryside, which for those who aren't familiar with the countryside of New Zealand, is basically just a bit of flat open fields with thin wire fences bordered by hedges or trees. Anyway, my parents wanted to discuss something in private, and both my brother and I were sent out for a small walk. We walked down to the end of her garden and along a very narrow path between an open field filled with nothing and a shed and rental property on the other side. I looked to my right, inside the rental property, and through the bushes. I see no one home, no car in the driveway, and no signs of life. So we continued and we came out onto the shared gravel driveway that a couple of other properties down the back of the property also use. We walked down the road and my grandmother's 2 cats suddenly appeared and joined us for a walk, which was kind of strange. However, about halfway between the rental and the cattle stop at the bottom of the road, the cats sit down and refuse to move. So we just kind of shrugged it off and we just continued walking. So we got down to the cattle stop and suddenly I was overcome with the worst ever feeling of dread, like nothing I'd ever felt before. It felt like something was watching us, and that if I so much as put 1 foot on the cattle stop, something horrifying would happen to me. I just froze for a few seconds because I was scared. I was terrified. I turned to my brother and said, "We should go, now." So we just walked back. So we got back to my grandmother's place, and not long after we were sitting down in the large sitting room where the family are. There was this horrible scream from outside. It was like a woman being murdered. It sounded like it came from right next door at the rental property. The talking stopped. No one said a thing. Eventually, they started talking again. I asked if anyone heard the screaming. Everyone said yes, and Mom said it was a banshee. So I thought nothing more. But anyway, a banshee is like this spirit of a woman, and it screams and it kind of just flies around in the air or something. And when someone has died or someone's about to die or something, you hear this scream of this creature, of this spirit. And it's like a sort of harbinger of doom or something. So I brought it up again a couple of months ago, and both my brother and Mom think that I'm making things up. Honestly, I don't know what to say, but I know what I heard.